In 1996, NVIDIA had 6 months to live. Their chips were dead on arrival, and their cash was almost gone. 6 actual months before the money ran out and the lights went dark. And their CEO, a 33-year-old immigrant named Jensen Huang, was staring down the barrel of complete bankruptcy. What happened next involved an 84-year-old engineer from Sega, a $5 million bet that defied all logic, and a rescue so improbable it reads like fiction. This is the story of how NVIDIA clawed its way back from the edge of oblivion to become the backbone of the artificial intelligence revolution. The story begins in 1963 in Tainan, Taiwan, where Jensen Huang was born into a family that couldn't stay in one place. They moved to Thailand when he was young, chasing opportunity in a world that offered few guarantees. Then, at just 9 years old, Huang landed in America with barely any English and even less certainty about what came next. What followed was the kind of grind that builds character in the hardest way possible. He worked restaurant jobs, dishwasher, waiter, whatever kept food on the table. These weren't the jobs you brag about. They were the jobs that taught you one fundamental lesson: survival isn't optional, and nobody's coming to save you. But even while scraping by, Huang was different. He skipped grades, dominated academically, and absorbed everything around him like he was preparing for a war nobody else could see coming. Oregon State University handed him an electrical engineering degree in 1984. Stanford gave him a master's in 1992. On paper, he'd already won. Immigrant kid turned credentialed engineer. The American dream in its purest form. But the real test, the one that would define everything, hadn't even begun. Subscribe now if you are eager to hear more. In 1993, San Jose, California, inside a Denny's restaurant, 3 engineers sat in a booth and started sketching the future on napkins. Jensen Huang, Chris Malachowski, and Curtis Priem weren't just talking about building another tech company. They were proposing something the industry thought was borderline suicidal: graphics chips, designed specifically for gaming and multimedia, at a time when most people believed that market was already too crowded and too risky to touch. But these 3 engineers saw something the rest of the world was missing. Personal computers were about to explode, and when they did, they wouldn't just need processing power, they'd need graphics horsepower to render, to visualize, to create. If that future was coming, someone had to build the engine that powered it. They scraped together $40,000 of their own money, hustled for venture capital backing, and named their company NVIDIA. The mission was audacious in its simplicity: make the chips that would define the next generation of visual computing. What they didn't know was just how brutal the execution would be. By 1995, NVIDIA's first wave of products hit the market, and they crashed hard. Not a slow fade, not modest underperformance. A full-scale failure that threatened to sink the entire company before it ever found its footing. By 1996, Jensen Huang was in full crisis mode. The company that once employed 100 people was gutted down to just 40. Mass layoffs swept through the office. Desks sat empty. The silence was suffocating. And Huang, forced to confront reality in its most brutal form, started opening every company meeting the same way. We're 30 days from going out of business. Not a motivational tactic, not some Steve Jobs-style mind game, just the cold, hard math of a company burning through its last reserves. Then came August 1997. NVIDIA was preparing to launch the Riva 128, their last product, their final shot at redemption. It was a Hail Mary in every sense of the phrase. If this chip didn't sell, the company would fold. And here's the part that still sounds impossible. When Riva 128 was about to launch, NVIDIA had exactly 1 month of payroll left in the bank. 30 days, 4 weeks. One final heartbeat before the company flatlined. The walls were closing in. The clock was ticking down. And nobody, not investors, not analysts, not even their own employees, believed they'd survive. Then, an 84-year-old engineer from Sega did something that changed everything. His name was Shoichiro Irimajiri, and he was a legend in Japanese engineering circles. At 84 years old, he'd seen entire industries rise and fall. He understood risk in a way most investors never would. When Irimajiri looked at NVIDIA's numbers, he saw what everyone else saw: a company on fire, burning through cash with no guarantee of survival. The smart money was running for the exits. But Irimajiri saw something else. He saw the technology, he saw the team, and most importantly, he saw Jensen Huang's refusal to quit, even when quitting was the only rational option. So Irimajiri convinced Sega to write a check for $5 million. Not a cautious loan with contingencies, not a hedge bet with an easy exit. A full-throated investment in a company that was 6 months away from complete collapse. That money gave Huang exactly what he needed most: time. Time to finish Riva 128. Time to get the product into the market. Time to prove that NVIDIA's vision wasn't just smoke and desperation. Without that $5 million, there's no product launch, no market validation, no NVIDIA. The story ends in bankruptcy court, and Jensen Huang becomes another cautionary tale about startup ambition meeting market reality. But that's not what happened. August 1997. The Riva 128 finally hit the market, and within 4 months, NVIDIA had sold 1 million units. The revenue started flooding in. The company stabilized. The nightmare that had consumed them for 2 years finally began to lift. But Jensen Huang wasn't interested in just surviving. He wanted to dominate, so he pushed harder. In 1999, NVIDIA launched the GeForce 256, and with it, they invented a term that didn't exist before: the Graphics Processing Unit, the GPU. NVIDIA didn't just make a better chip, they defined an entire category and claimed it as their own. Suddenly, the company that was 30 days from bankruptcy was setting the standard for an entire industry. Gaming companies needed their chips. Multimedia creators depended on their power. The market didn't just acknowledge NVIDIA, it bent toward them. The product that flopped in 1995 became the foundation. The edge of bankruptcy became the launch pad. And Jensen Huang, the immigrant kid who once washed dishes to survive, was now reshaping the future of computing. But even that was just the beginning. In 2006, NVIDIA launched something called CUDA, and it quietly changed everything. CUDA wasn't just another graphics card or a faster chip. It was a complete rethinking of what a GPU could do. Instead of limiting their processors to graphics rendering, NVIDIA turned them into general-purpose parallel processing machines. Translation: their chips could now handle far more than games. They could crunch massive datasets, run complex simulations, and power scientific research at scales nobody had imagined before. At first, the implications weren't obvious, but researchers in artificial intelligence and machine learning started using NVIDIA GPUs to train neural networks. And suddenly, the entire landscape shifted. Data centers began stacking NVIDIA chips by the thousands. Autonomous vehicle companies built their entire computational infrastructure around them. AI labs made NVIDIA hardware the default standard. Gaming had been the entry point, the proof of concept that kept the company alive. But AI became the empire. By the 2020s, NVIDIA wasn't just another chip manufacturer competing for market share. They were critical infrastructure for the entire artificial intelligence revolution. Their GPUs trained the language models behind ChatGPT. They powered the computer vision systems in self-driving cars. They ran the simulations that predicted climate patterns, diagnosed diseases, and generated art. The company that nearly died in a San Jose office with 1 month of payroll now controlled the computational backbone of the AI age. By 2025, NVIDIA briefly touched a $4 trillion market capitalization, making it one of the most valuable companies on the planet. Jensen Huang, who still owns roughly 3.5% of the company, now has a net worth that exceeds $140 billion. But the story here isn't just about wealth accumulation. It's about influence. Huang's law, his observation that GPU performance doubles every year, has become the new Moore's law, the benchmark by which the entire industry measures progress. He walks onto stages at tech conferences wearing the same leather jacket he's worn for years, and when he speaks, the entire industry stops to listen. CEOs adjust strategies, investors move billions, startups pivot their entire roadmaps based on what NVIDIA announces next. The immigrant kid who worked restaurant jobs to survive now shapes the trajectory of global computing. The 33-year-old CEO who had 6 months to live now runs the most influential chip company on Earth. The underdog didn't just win. He became untouchable. But dominance never silences the noise. Critics call AI a speculative bubble waiting to burst. Supply chains strain under unprecedented demand. Competitors like Intel and AMD are sharpening their strategies, looking for cracks in NVIDIA's armor. Jensen Huang has heard all of it before. He's faced the kind of existential crisis that breaks most people. And what he learned from 1996 is this: victory isn't about avoiding crisis. It's about refusing to break when crisis comes. NVIDIA's internal culture still carries that edge, that hunger, that refusal to assume safety or comfort. Because Huang remembers the empty desks. He remembers the brutal math of those final weeks. He remembers the gut-wrenching fear of knowing you're one product launch away from total failure. And he remembers the 84-year-old engineer who looked at a dying company and bet $5 million anyway. That memory doesn't fade. It becomes the foundation. Here's what Jensen Huang's story teaches us. Near death doesn't have to be the end. Sometimes it's the catalyst that forces you to find out what you're actually made of. Crisis strips away the comfortable narratives and forces you to confront reality in its rawest form. It reveals who you are when the safety nets are gone and the easy options have evaporated. And sometimes, just sometimes, a single act of faith, one person willing to bet on you when all the smart money is running away, becomes the difference between collapse and empire. Huang didn't have a backup plan. He didn't have wealthy investors waiting in the wings. He had a deadline, a skeleton crew, and one final product that had to work. He took the shot. And that shot didn't just save NVIDIA, it built the future. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment below and tell us which founder's near-death story we should cover next.